Good evening. I'm Jim Hogue, editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. LaGuardia for once worked. The normal rules that apply to these sessions are all in place except for one. This is not an off-the-record session. This is an on-the-record session. We're going to have a discussion of our panelists up here for the better part of 45 minutes to an hour, and then we're going to turn to you all for questions. At that time, of course, you know the rule. Identify yourselves, ask your questions succinctly, please. We'll try and get you some succinct answers. Well, the reason we're here, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, we're publishing a 15,000-word article called The Tiananmen Papers. It's an adaptation from a book of the same name. The article is a compilation, a really unusual compilation of material from documents that depict the struggle of Chinese leaders over how to meet the challenge presented by the student demonstrations that took place in many Chinese cities, including Beijing, in the spring of 1989. The material we have are transcripts of key meetings, phone calls, and intelligence reports that were brought to the United States by a courier alleging to represent reform elements within the communist hierarchy. The courier claims that the intent of himself and his associates is to press for a renewed debate, discussion, if you will, on political reform at this time when China is preparing for leadership changes scheduled to take place in the year 2002 and 2003. The courier says that he and his associates believe that political reform has got to start, or at least the discussion of it again, has got to start with the reconsideration of the official verdict on the Tiananmen demonstrations, that they were the handiwork of counter-revolutionaries rather than the outpouring of students seeking modernization. The verbatim accounts that make up this unusual article present neither a black or white picture of the demonstrators or of the leaders. The demonstrators constantly changed their membership in the square, in particular, their leadership, and the extent of their demands. The leaders, for their part, started pretty much unanimous with the intention to try and resolve the protests peacefully. At least that's what comes across in the dialogue in these documents. While, of course, maintaining Communist Party control and enforcing public order. A split developed in the leadership, however, as the demonstrations went forward over many weeks. When key members of the leadership became convinced that military suppression was going to be necessary because they feared outsiders had taken control of the demonstrations and meant to topple the regime. Today we're going to discuss, as I think we must, the authenticity of these documents, the motivation of their providers, and the potential effects on politics and policy both in China and here in the United States. Now, for this discussion, we're very lucky to have J. Stapleton Roy, who has held a number of important posts in the State Department, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Executive Secretary and Special Assistant to the Secretary of State, several ambassadorial posts, including to the People's Republic of China from 1991 to 1995, and most recently, Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. Douglas Paul, President of the Asia Pacific Policy Center, and formerly Special Assistant to Presidents Bush and Reagan for National Security Affairs, and Senior Director for Asian Affairs on the National Security Council. He also served in the U.S. embassies in Singapore and Beijing. David Shambaugh, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, and Director of the China Policy Program at George Washington University. A prolific author, his most recent article, entitled Facing Reality in China Policy, appears along with the Tiananmen Papers in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. And finally, Andrew Nathan, Political Science Professor at Columbia University, and co-editor with Perry Link of the Tiananmen Papers book and author of the introduction to the documents that have been adopted in foreign affairs. And I'm going to start with Professor Nathan. There has been, as there should be, quite a bit of rumination on the question of authenticity of these documents. A number of scholars, including Andrew, have looked at them and are of the opinion that they are indeed genuine. The Chinese government has released a statement that is somewhat ambiguous. Other voices from China, associates of the former General Secretary Zhao Jiang, have said that they think they are genuine. And I'm going to ask Andy to elaborate on the process by which these documents were assessed by himself and the others who worked with him, and how they came to the conclusion that although a final determination can't be made, we are after all dealing with a regime that operates in considerable secrecy, how they finally came to a conclusion that these indeed were authentic, and therefore extremely important to our understanding of what happened then and the effects of then on now. Andy?
A lot of what I have to say about this is in the introduction to the book and in the afterword written by Orville Schell. And in a way, it's a disadvantage that we're having this meeting before you all have had a chance to read it, probably most of you to read that stuff. For those who have, I apologize if I repeat anything that you already know. I know that the documents are authentic, or that the material in the book is authentic, let's put it that way. I don't want to use the word documents because I want to make clear that what I worked with was a manuscript that I asked the compiler to produce. The compiler told me at the beginning that he had an enormous amount of material, and I said, in order to work with this, we'll need something that's arranged in chronological order and which has some explanations on it and some headings and so forth. So he produced a 516-page Chinese language manuscript from a computer, just as you would produce any kind of manuscript, and gave that to me eventually. The authentication by Perry and me, and later on by Orville, dealt first of all with the material that we were presented with. As we worked to edit this stuff, to select the most important parts and have those translated and edit the translations, we ran into numerous issues of language, of content that we had to resolve, sometimes by asking the compiler, sometimes by checking with other sources and people that we knew. Some of the material that we checked had to do with facts that on the one hand were not public and couldn't have been researched by somebody who was trying to fake something, and on the other hand were things that I was able to check without creating curiosity on the part of various people as to what I was checking. A few of them were things that Perry and I knew ourselves. And all of that checked out, and also sort of linguistic issues. I've heard quite a bit of commentary on the internet that some of the language isn't correct. That's because people are reading translations from the English into Chinese. The real Chinese language of the real documents, only a little bit of that has been published so far in the United Daily News in Taiwan, and the rest of it will come out when the whole book comes out, which is 3 times as much material as we've been able to put into the English language book. In April, that will come out and you'll all have a chance to look at it. So the material itself, and as Jim alluded as well, and this plays a role, the complexity of it, the lack of a black and white, the fact that you can see how Li Peng or Deng Xiaoping or any of these people came to their decisions and how those decisions made sense. There aren't any real clear villains and heroes. Zhao Ziyang looks like a person lacking both political skill and decisiveness at a crucial moment. Li Peng looks like a very able politician with a clear vision and so forth. That's not the whole picture of either of these people, but those are aspects. Secondly, the compiler himself, who claimed to be a certain person, and I was able to check up to some degree on whether he was that person, and he is. Besides which, his deportment and dealings with us throughout the entire process, his ability to answer questions and things of that nature, helped further to convince us. And finally, toward the end of the process, I shared, of course, Orville and Perry had both been in China at that time and know quite a lot about it. I wasn't there then. Toward the end, we took either the Chinese or the English manuscript and showed it to a few people, a very small number of people, some Chinese and some not. And one of those people who has come out in public and identified himself as Jim Lilly, and his qualifications are known to all of you and can hardly be beaten. He felt that the material was authentic, but there were some others who also encouraged us in that belief. That was the process. I'd be happy to answer more questions.
Ask the rest of the panelists who have not had the chance to discuss this with the compiler at length, or some of the checking which you all did do, and cannot fully describe for reasons of security, but you had a chance to read at least that which is in Foreign Affairs. What observations do you have on the authenticity or possible authenticity of these documents? Steve?
I think it's an issue that needs to be quickly looked at and then brushed aside. We wouldn't even have the documents to look at if they hadn't been looked at by people like Professor Nathan, who was satisfied with their authenticity. That's a pretty good endorsement by somebody who's immersed himself in it. But the second thing is, having only read the Foreign Affairs coverage of the documents, and there's a lot more material out there that I haven't had a chance to look at, the fact is that I went through them carefully, through the Foreign Affairs article carefully, looking for anything that didn't ring true with our understanding of attitudes and developments in connection with Tiananmen. I couldn't find any. So if they're forgeries, they're excellent forgeries. And if so, what does it matter? You know, I always like to find an excellent forgery in an antique shop as long as it's identified as a forgery because it's cheaper, but it's just as good as the original that you pay astronomical sums for. So in this sense, these papers are good enough to enable us to refocus on the significance of Tiananmen, which I think is the important issue. And the question of the authenticity of the documents is the secondary issue. Now, I don't want to detract from Professor Nathan in any way, but he's done the work for us. He may be wrong, incidentally. There are enormous examples of how good forgeries can fool the best experts. We have them both in China and in Europe.
Because if we are stuck with forgeries, I'm very glad for Foreign Affairs' sake that they're absolutely first-rate ones and second-rate. David, you have any comments?
Well, Stape, you're obviously not married to an art historian as I am. She never allows me to buy forgeries or even good replicas. But I have to say myself that I'm going to reserve judgment on the authenticity of these documents until I see the original Chinese that will be published in April, which, as Andy just said, is going to be 3 times as long. I say that for 2 reasons. Much of the translation does not strike me as, or some of the translation, I should say, does not strike me as common usage in communist leadership documents. And I've read a fair number of them. I'm troubled by that, but I think it's a problem of translation rather than the documents themselves. And Andy and I and Perry Link have had discussions about this over the last week. There is always a difficulty for a translator to be accurate. And many translators try to be accurate by being colloquial. But by being colloquial, I think that you've changed, or the team of translators have changed the actual language that may be in those documents. But I don't know that until I see those documents. Now, having said that, I completely agree with what Stape just said. They track completely with everything we knew at the time and reconstructed after the fact. So that is a vote of confidence in the authenticity of the documents. But I want to see the documents themselves. And if you worked with a compiled transcript, this is the first time I've heard this, as opposed to the actual documents, that's a one level removed. That concerns me, actually.
Any comments on that before we go forward?
Well, you need to think through why it concerns you. The issue would be the documents would have had to be transcribed. You're not going to publish, this is not art. With all due respect to your wife, and a sheaf of facsimiles of documents wouldn't have any art value. It's got to be transcribed and compiled, and it has to be put in order, and you have to have a thing that says this is a meeting that took place and this is what happened, and then you've got to set it in type and all that. That has to be done. Who would do that? I had a life of my own before this started, and I didn't have a huge endowment with which to hire a team of scribes. I told the guy, do it yourself. And who better to do it? Now, the issue would be, did he do it in a way that biased the output? But you have to read the book and see. There clearly are things missing. I mean, I say all this in the intro. I told him, leave out the stuff that's not interesting. Leave out the stuff we already know. We don't want all the reports about the students in the square. We've got the books, we've got the movies, we've seen that. We want the stuff in Zhongnanhai. He believed that the leadership paid a lot of attention to reports in foreign media, and he insisted on including in the Chinese book these translations from English and French and German and so forth into the Chinese intelligence reports on what the foreign media are saying. We, of course, squeezed them way, way down in the English book. Who the hell wants to read that stuff? So there are processes of selection which have to be done if one is going to produce a book that people will read. And Jim Hogue himself did a process of selection to get this whole book down to 15,000 words. I think he did a brilliant job of tearing the central thread out of this whole book. But that's inevitable. So it shouldn't alarm you too much, and we shouldn't have a fetishism of physical documents. You've seen them, I've seen them. We know what they look like, but they can be faked as well.
Doug Paul has just recently been in Beijing, and I'm going to ask him any comments from there on the authenticity question, and then we'll move on. The other subjects I want to try and cover before we go to free-for-all are the motivation. Can we believe what the courier tells us is the reason why these documents are coming out at this time? And then we'll go on to the meaning or lack of meaning of them. Do they really have some current effect of some potency, or is this kind of for the historical record? But Doug, first.
Well, I'll mention what I heard in Beijing up until Saturday in a moment. But first, I think I was invited here because I presumably would have seen the best of what the American government had to see at the time these events were transpiring. And I'm supposed to bear witness to whether or not it's reasonably accurate, and I think it is. I looked at the 10 volumes I have of Tiananmen documents in my home library that are openly published documents, and I don't see any major gap there. There's one gap which I think the book may take care of. There's a very brief mention in the article that I read about the military readily saluting to the need to take martial law over Beijing. And my recollection is there was a lot more backing and toing and froing rather by the Chinese military at the time, and maybe Andy can address that. Perhaps this compiler did not address that, but that's one area where there's just a slight gap. But it does not, in my view, cast any doubt on the authenticity of the fundamental documents. Second observation is, unlike Staper, I've been only in a few meetings with Zhao Ziyang and quite a few more with Li Peng over the years. And although we have idioms used to make effective translations from Chinese idioms, and these idioms are very different, though they have the same meaning in the final analysis, I was hearing the voice of the Zhao Ziyang and Li Peng I had heard before. I think that's essentially captured by this document, and on very sensitive topics, and it would be hard to have both the voice and the access to the sensitivity and get it right without having the real documents in hand. Now, in the last week in Beijing, I was there while the central government deliberated a few days and then decided to make a comment about the inauthenticity of the documents. And I've been able to talk to experts. First, these documents are fairly widely understood in very general form in China among those who are operating on the internet. They have to move fast, however, because the internet questions that are posed or comments posed in various chat rooms disappear through the screening process very quickly. And so I think it's, whatever the impact was intended to have on the central leadership, certainly there's a broader mass impact, an intellectual impact already. Secondly, the response that ultimately came from the central leadership shows there has been an impact on them. Whether this is going to have the far-reaching implications that the compiler allegedly has in mind, certainly they've touched a chord within the Chinese leadership. If I were Jiang Zemin, I would not be happy to see my succession so demonstrably made to appear illegitimate. If I were Li Peng, I would not like to see myself visibly passed over for the #1 job, having been so active in promoting himself, promoting the cause of taking on the students. So those are some initial observations.
Some observations that have been made about these documents is that they kind of set Li Peng up as the bad guy, as the one who used information to manipulate Deng Xiaoping to become the orderer, if you will, of the military suppression that ultimately ended the Tiananmen demonstrations. Is that because it appears to be inherently true, or are the documents somewhat constructed and perhaps translated to bring that message to us? What do you think, Andy?
Doug raises this interesting question. I remember as well that we heard that there were 7 generals who opposed it. There's nothing like that in the book. There has to be selection in the book, of course, and there visibly are things missing. Now, that could be missing because it never happened. I don't know. I do not know. Maybe you guys know, you and Stape know, whether that really did happen, but it's certainly not in the book. What we do have in the book is that the retired marshals Ne Rongjun and Xu Xiangchen were unhappy about it, but they had recused themselves even from the group of elders and didn't participate. There are other things that are not in the book because I think the compiler doesn't possess them. For example, Deng says at one of the meetings, he says, before this meeting, I talked with comrades Chen Yun and Li Xianyan, and we think da-da-da-da, but we don't have those talks. We don't know why we don't have them, or I don't know why we don't have them. We have one report on the death toll. There's been a lot of debate about this, and we only have one report, which is by the Beijing Party Secretary Li Shiming to the Politburo, which has the flavor of, you guys wanted a low death toll and no deaths in the square, and I'm happy to tell you that we have delivered what you asked for. So it has the credibility of, just that much, and we don't have any other report to check it against. So there clearly are things missing. My sense and Perry's sense and Orville's sense of the seriousness of the compiler and his fealty to history and so forth was that he would not have engaged in that type of selection where he had a document and held it back. But as to the process by which he obtained documents, despite the fact that what he's done is very remarkable, it doesn't mean that he's totally omnipotent and omniscient. He may have been unable to acquire certain documents that may exist. In fact, one would think that has to be the case. And I can certainly say that in my selection process of picking things from the Chinese manuscript to put in the English manuscript, you'll all have a chance to review that when the Chinese manuscript comes out. So let's see, I've lost track of your question now.
No, we're going to go with David, who's got a comment.
Academic.
You'll think of it.
Well, I don't find any blockbuster new facts in the book, and I've actually read the book page cover to cover. There are a number of nuggets in there, and one of the most notable nuggets is, in fact, this point, Andy and Doug, about senior military elders opposing the use of force. Now, at the time, there were reports that there was a petition written to the Central Committee by a number of elders that included Ne Rongjun. But in your book, on May 20th, I don't have the page number, there is a document that indicates, let's see, 9 different military elders opposing the troops to enter the city after martial law had been proclaimed. Wang Ping, Ye Fei, Zhang Ai Ping, Xiao Ke, Yang Dezhi, Chen Sai Dao, Tseng Shi
That
Lin.
is that 7 generals.
It's not a petition, but they sent, according to this document, a 1-sentence letter to Deng Xiaoping. Said, do not send the troops into the city to enforce martial law. That's one nugget I took away. Another one is the problem of corruption and how seriously the leadership took that throughout the period up to June 4th, and how they wanted to create committees and other things to deal with corruption and examine their own children and their own families and so on. That struck me. Third nugget, the closing of the World Economic Herald in Shanghai. Clearly much more documentation on that than we've ever known before, which is, of course, what helped propel Jiang Zemin to Beijing. And the fourth nugget, I find, if it's a nugget, is that Deng Xiaoping, up to and after the massacre, was adamant about the need to proceed with reform, economic reform in particular. And it shows in many ways how Li Peng and the post-June 4th leadership usurped his desires and how they sidelined him and forced him in 1992 to finally take that so-called Southern tour to force reform back onto the agenda. So these are small nuggets, no major blockbuster points. I guess the one other thing, if I could just finish, that's really struck me from reading these is the role of the Ministry of State Security in internal intelligence. We as foreigners know that the Ministry of State Security is responsible for counterintelligence against people like us when we're in China. But when it was formed in 1982-83, it was modeled on the KGB as to having dual missions, internal as well as counterintelligence, and external. They also send agents abroad. The reports flowing into the Zhongnan High and recorded in the book are extraordinary in the penetration of the student movement and the cities across the country and workers and other units by the Ministry of State Security. This strikes me as really Orwellian and totalitarian, and makes one sort of pause and realize just how good intelligence leadership had and how penetrated that society still is.
Let me move on to motivations, which is another way actually of getting at the authenticity question. As I mentioned, the Courier says that he and the associates that he represents, presumably pretty high up in the communist hierarchy, are hoping that these documents will at least assist the process of jump-starting discussion about political reform, which they believe has been essentially frozen since Tiananmen Square. And they believe it ought to be restarted, not only because maybe of the inherent good of political reform, but that the economic reform is not going to be able to continue to go forward if there isn't some change in the political system that gives more participation to people, more rule of law, and so forth and so on. Now, there are a couple of assumptions to this motivation, if we are to believe it. One is that Tiananmen Square still counts in China. Are people really thinking about this? Do they really care whether the official verdict is overturned? Will it, in short, be or could it be a factor in the maneuverings that will go on between now and the leadership decisions in 2002 and 2003? Steve, maybe you could start us off.
It still does matter very much, although people don't talk about it openly, because one of the consequences of the crackdown was people internalized their attitudes and didn't express them openly in the way that they had in the pre-Tiananmen period. But the way I'd like to get at the issue is to note that the really important issue that emerges from Tiananmen is the issue that Deng himself was most focused on, and that's the relationship between stability and change. Deng was committed to changing China. He wanted China to become rich and powerful. But his aversion to the uncontrolled and purposeless violence of the Cultural Revolution had given him an enormous feeling that it had to be controlled change. He didn't object to a little instability. If you recall, he was behind the democracy wall period in 1978. But as soon as it had accomplished its purpose, he then fully backed a restoration of tight control. Now, the interesting thing, if we look at the last 20 years, is that the 80s generated a series of leaders, and I would include Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who essentially were prepared to run risks of instability in order to bring about change that they saw as necessary. And I reflected on this even early in the 80s, because I attended a series of meetings with Zhao Ziyang and Li Peng back in that period. Li Peng was the vice premier, and Zhao Ziyang at the time was the premier. Zhao talked about price reform, for example, as an economist. To him, the purpose of price reform was to send signals to the producer on whether they produce this or that, so that he understood that price reform had to be fundamental price reform. Li Peng always talked about price reform the way a Soviet bureaucrat might have. The issue of price reform is, how do you control the popular reaction to it? If Li Peng had been premier, in my judgment, during the early 80s, you would never have had price reform in China, because you cannot accomplish price reform without running levels of instability. And if you look at the period from 1986, when price reform was implemented, you had skyrocketing inflation. You then had a sudden tightening up of the economy, dropping growth by about 12%, and that contributed to the political volatility, and in a sense, Tiananmen was one of the prices that China paid in order to implement price reform. But when I went back to China 10 years later, price reform had brilliantly succeeded because they did it right. They permitted prices to skyrocket in ways that would produce a revolution in the United States. If we suddenly found that meat and bread were costing us 75% more, think of the reaction. Look at what's happening on the energy front. Zhao Ziyang was prepared to deal with that sort of thing. But the interesting thing in the second half of the last 2 decades is China hasn't generated any leaders who would fit the pattern of a Zhao Ziyang or a Hu Yaobang. In other words, the need for stability and kind of orthodoxy permeates the leadership. Let's assume that a purpose of these papers was somehow to influence the leadership succession in the 16th Party Congress 2 years from now. Who is it among the leaders that we think somehow might be prepared to take up the cudgels of a Zhao Ziyang? You can't do it. I read an article in the Hong Kong press by Zhang Liang, who was being interviewed on this question. And he went through the Politburo members one by one and pointed out all the reasons why they weren't going to be supportive openly of reversing the verdicts on Tiananmen. But the fact is, and it's very important, and it's pointed out in your introduction, that's the point, that there was widespread sympathy in the government and in the bureaucracy for the goals of the protesters in the square. We have to remember that, because the purge that followed Tiananmen was an extraordinarily limited purge. It knocked off Hu Qili, Zhao Ziyang, and a few of the top leaders. But everybody else in the bureaucracy who had sympathized with the Tiananmen demonstrators was still in the bureaucracy. The difference was that they had to trim their sails to the new winds in China. Now, that means essentially that you have a political establishment in China that recognizes that change is necessary and wants change to occur. But they don't have leadership that is able to mobilize them in order to have the change take place in a way that doesn't create too much of a specter of disorder, or luan, as the Chinese put it. One of the things that you encountered in talking to people in China, and I'm referring to the first half of the 90s when I was there, was there was, even among those most sympathetic to Tiananmen, a kind of revisionist rethinking of the question of instability had gone too far, and with instability, you can't get the economic growth that we need. So this is the issue that is really confronting the Chinese and that Tiananmen confronts them with, which is, if you can't get change without running risks of instability, are you going to be able to manage the process? And the answer is you can't do it if there's not some leader who recognizes the problem and is prepared to take those risks. Zhao Ziyang and Deng Xiaoping both were prepared to do it, but in Deng's case, he thought that both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang had been too permissive in the way they dealt with the risks of instability. So the question, in some ways, that ought to come out of a re-examination of the Tiananmen papers is, if we're able to reverse the verdict, what are the conclusions that should come? What should the pace of change be in China? I would take the position, for example, that if Tiananmen had succeeded, if you had opened up the political system in China in 1989, it would have failed. It would have failed because economic development hadn't gone anywhere during the 80s. The explosive growth in China took place during the 90s, not the 80s. In the 90s, you had the new middle classes emerge all over southeastern China. You now have a critical mass of people who want participation in a political system, who are educated and have money, that have seen the outside world. If Tiananmen were to occur now, it would be totally different, because there's a base now within China for positive change to take place if it doesn't take place too rapidly. In 1981, that base didn't exist. But the aspirations for change existed. And those aspirations still remain, but they're bottled up. And the question is, what Chinese leader is going to read the Tiananmen papers and draw the conclusion from them, which is the only correct conclusion in my opinion, which is that a process of controlled change must take place. Andy Nathan points out in his introduction that there's this widespread view in the West that where globalization and modernization occur, fundamental changes in the party-state system are inevitable, leading to the rise of civil society and some form of democracy. Well, basically, that's true. Whether it's some form of democracy or whether it's some form of representative government, I don't care. Your problem is this. In the West, we think about that process in much too short a time frame. It's what I call proving that grass doesn't grow. You want to prove that grass doesn't grow? Take a chair, sit somebody down in your yard, and say, watch the grass. 4 hours later, say, did you see anything? They say no. So you've established conclusively that this change isn't taking place. What's wrong with the process? You're establishing a time frame for estimating the change that's radically too short. We know that grass does grow, and we know that modernization and globalization inevitably produce change. But it doesn't produce change within a 4-year term of one administration, and it doesn't produce change at the pace that outsiders wanted to produce. And so in China, there is this pervasive sense that change must take place, but they lack the leadership in order to control the process. That's all I'm going to say.
Wow, very good.
We have leadership changes coming, and you're telling us there's going to really be no change. Can they get by with that? Or, because you were talking about time frames, the alternative to long, long time frames is huge eruptions, like French revolutions and so on.
Quick comment. You know, I go from China to Indonesia. Suharto's been in power for 30 years, you know, no change. Everybody says it'll go on for the next 30 years. What happens? Economic downturn, all of a sudden, no legitimacy for Suharto. That's exactly the challenge China faces. Take away economic growth, and the Chinese communist leadership has no clothes. Deng understood that. I've been at 2 sessions with Deng where he's basically said that we have to justify ourselves by outperforming capitalism. Find any Marxism in that. Zilch. It's a pragmatic recognition that the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy rested on economic growth. Take away the growth, you got a problem. Are Chinese leaders too foolish to see that? Not on your life. You can sit in China during the 90s and talk to high-level officials who will openly tell you that that's the case. So the fact that those sentiments are there is incontrovertible. What's lacking is anyone capable of channeling those aspirations in a constructive way. And the current effort to do it is producing this appearance of rigidity, which is false, because the changes are taking place beneath that external rigidity, and if they don't eventually change, you're going to get a break. And that's what some of the Chinese leaders are worried about, but we can't identify who they are and how that process may occur.
Let me ask the other panelists for any observations you've got. This is really a central point. Tiananmen, you're saying, safe, if I hear you correctly, it certainly does count, symbolically certainly, and what it represents counts, but there's real questions about what effect it can have because the leadership is in a position to take advantage of it or put it to use. Doug?
Well, I think another way of saying what Stape has just said is that the The regime is determined to prevent the rise of any organized alternative to the leadership or any even remote facsimile of an organized body apart from leadership control. And we're seeing that played out very dramatically in the suppression of the Falun Gong, which is really not a political entity at all from outward appearances, but is being treated as if it were a life-threatening kind of opposition forming in China. The Democracy Party was stamped out 3 years ago, and we continue to see sentences and rough treatment handed out to people who identify themselves with that. So, yes, you can prolong the time before your next paroxysm with effective police work.
Yeah.
You know, I think that Stape's right, that there's a recognition beneath the leadership of the need for change, for political change. But unfortunately, within the leadership, I think they've drawn just the wrong lessons from not only 1989, but then 1990-91 in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union. The lessons they seem to have drawn is, one, that economic growth is crucial. Without it, you can kiss your regime goodbye. Secondly, that, and this comes through very clearly in the documents, you have in the book, Andy, a wonderful long series of discussions amongst the leaders about the attempt by the West and the United States in particular to usurp the Chinese regime and undermine it. They came to the conclusion that this was all orchestrated from without, and of course, you know, it's a continuation from John Foster Dulles through to 1989. So that's the second lesson they drew. Third, don't sanction civil society, particularly labor unions, and that's one that really came home to them once the regime in Poland fell. Third, maintain control of the armed forces and the security apparatus, tight control. They learned that lesson from Ceausescu in Romania, if not their own lesson. Fourth, don't show elite factionalism. And they've done a good job since 1989 at masking any elite factionalism, if indeed it's there. Fifth, I guess, intense propaganda work. Really work on the minds of the population. And they have done that. And finally, do not begin down the path of political liberalization, as Gorbachev did and some of the East European regimes flirted with. That is a recipe, it's a slippery slope for disaster. So they have drawn, to my mind, precisely, well, from their perspective, the right lessons, but the wrong lessons vis-a-vis this pressure from below that Stape has so correctly identified.
And I agree with what everybody has said. I'd just like to add that with the publication of this book, you actually see the grass growing. Don't forget that this book is a Chinese...
Very long book.
The publication of the book is an event in Chinese politics. It's not chiefly a thing about American publishing and the Foreign Affairs magazine and the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. We are the epiphenomenon. The phenomenon is that somebody in China did this. Even if it were as Stape so eloquently put it, even if it were a fake, you know, it would still be a phenomenon that somebody in China faked this, but that is not the case. What's even more exciting is that it's real and somebody in China did it. It couldn't be just anybody. It has to be somebody with some kind of something within the top leadership to have been able to do a thing like this. So this is the grass growing. You have to ask yourself, why does Jiang Zemin repeatedly state the case is closed, the correct decision was reached, and it cannot be reopened? If this doesn't matter, then he could say, yeah, discuss it. Hyde Park, it's a difference, but he never says that. Why? What are the implications? I think the implications are that if one reopens this and one comes to the conclusion that something that the party did was wrong, partly wrong, or entirely wrong, that the student movement was entirely or partly right, then the issues that are entailed by that are the issues of political reform. And I think it was David, I forget who, it was both David and Stape, who said that they were impressed with how far Zhao was willing to go. And I think that's another one of the interesting things you learn from the book, is how improvisatory Zhao was, how willing he was to sort of step out on a thin wire over the rushing maelstrom and just try to solve this problem by actually talking with civil society and see what might happen. And of course, we know that previous to '89, Zhao had in fact called a political reform study group together. They had discussed all sorts of things. Their eventual report was watered down, but there has indeed been an abiding issue of whether or not to fundamentally change the way the Chinese Communist Party operates. And it seems to me much more than personnel arrangements after 2002 that this fundamental issue that's 15 or so years old is the issue that's bubbling up here with this project coming out. The actual impact, nonetheless, of course, politics is, as we know in Washington, D.C., that high ideals and broad trends of development are inseparable from the actual distribution of power among politicians. So I don't doubt that coming as it does, the book will have some impact or is aimed at having a deleterious impact on the ability of Li Peng and Jiang Zemin to continue to exercise influence after their retirements from these official posts. By the way, David, on the question of whether there's anything new in here, so much depends on what you knew before. And I think what's particularly important to remember now is that people in China knew a lot less than we knew, a lot less than David knows. All the footnotes that we have in the book about this document was published before here and that document was published before there, are footnotes to stuff that was published in Hong Kong and later translated into English that people in China have never seen. The only thing that most people in China have ever seen was the report that the mayor of Beijing gave, I forget exactly when, in June or so, the Black Hands of Tiananmen, Chen Shitung's long report where he said that it was all done by Wang Juntao and Chen Shiming. So Chen Ziming, yeah. So this, which we don't reproduce in the book. So a lot of it is new, and even some things in the book that I'm sure all of us on the panel always knew are new to some people. For example, I've recently read in a book by a reputable China expert that Deng Xiaoping's only post in 1989 was as chairman of the Chinese Bridge Association. The fundamental fact of 1989 is that Deng was chairman of the Central Military Commission. So if you didn't know that, now you're going to find that out.
Before we give up here and turn to you all, I do want to spend a little time on the issue of what effect the Tiananmen Papers and what we learned from them might have on politics and policy here on this side of the Pacific, so to speak. As I mentioned, David Schaumbaugh has a piece that wasn't written as a companion to Tiananmen Papers. He didn't know it was coming, but it's in the same issue. And it essentially makes, I'm not doing his piece justice, but it makes the point that this is probably our most important bilateral relationship going forward in the future, that it has some very pressing issues that need to be addressed. It also has some very big long-term issues, that it's a policy that has to go across quite a spectrum. Then that raises the question, what kind of effect will the Tiananmen Papers, if any, have on the dialogue that's going on in this country? In the Congress, there's been really a breakdown in any kind of consensus view of China and what U.S. policy ought to be, with far more views on the extremes of the left and the right than we have seen in the past. David?
Oh, goodness, I was afraid you were going to put me on the spot. I'd rather defer to Stape and Doug on this because they know the effect on policy better than I, having served in government much longer. My guess is that if it has an effect, and frankly I'm dubious it's going to have much of any effect in China. If it has an effect in this country, it's only going to bolster the long, what I call the missionary complex of the United States to change and remold China in its liberal image. But I suspect that 6 months from now, this book and these papers are not going to be that consequential in U.S. policy debates about China.
How about politics?
On the Hill, it's going to fuel many, and in society at large, and indeed Congress represents our society, we understand, it's going to fuel this desire to change China. And in my piece, one thing I argue in the magazine is that we should speak very clearly about our American desire for the ultimate democratization of China and not fudge that issue. That's something I do personally believe very much.
Steve?
I don't know what the impact in China will be, and in a way it'll be difficult to estimate until a Chinese version of the papers comes out so they can get wide distribution there. In this country, I suspect it will have more impact than it should, to put it bluntly. There's Andy Nathan refers to the fact that some people who were unfamiliar with what happened in Tiananmen will learn new things from this, and that's true. The generic government bureaucrat and the generic politician in the United States and the generic American citizen doesn't know anything about Tiananmen other than the fact that it took place and it was a bloody suppression of democratic students. So there's a tendency also to see China, because of the rigidity with which the leadership has succeeded in keeping any new manifestations of Tiananmen from occurring, of thinking that China hasn't changed since Tiananmen. China has changed enormously since Tiananmen. The economy of China now, compared to the economy of 1989, bears no comparison. The face of Shanghai, when I went back to it in 1991, was not that different from the Shanghai that I left in 1950. Whereas if you go to Shanghai today, you will see a completely changed city. The impact of the experts educated outside China has been progressive inside China. You now have a skilled expert level in China that permeates every province and virtually every government department, where there are people who have been trained in the West, spent a year or two at Rutgers or somewhere else. All of this has continued and indeed not slowed down since Tiananmen. And the impact is cumulative. So the danger is that we're going to, like Neanderthals, take ourselves back 10 years and think that this describes a China that still exists. It doesn't exist. The problem of controlled political change and how you relate that to the stability necessary for continued economic growth, that remains. That problem hasn't been solved. But in every other respect, the factors that impact on how China needs to change have changed radically since 1989, and I fear that there may be too simplistic a willingness on the part of the American political establishment to think that maybe this is a description of the China that the new administration has to deal with.
Very good. Doug?
Well, starting from Stape's assumption that people come into government all the time who know very little about this subject and don't carry the baggage of experts, I would say that there are some lessons that government officials ought to learn from the papers. One of them is the fragility of the Chinese leadership structure. While their success and performance and the integration of high-quality talent into the leadership has given them some strength, still when it comes to interrelationships of the elite, it's an essentially fragile process as demonstrated by these papers, and it's not much different today from what it was back then. And anybody who goes in head-to-head with them should understand that background. They probably will get briefed out anyway. Secondly, there are two faces of Chinese intelligence that come through in these papers. One is the factual characterization presented by a number of authorities to the leadership of what's actually happening in the streets. And I assume the book will give me even more ample demonstration of that. And the other is the political use of intelligence, not something that we're unfamiliar with ourselves. And Li Peng does this to a fare thee well. And again, an American Secretary of State or counterpart or president sitting across from the Chinese leadership, if he doesn't get it right away from the characterizations that emerge from Chinese mouths in the course of their dialogue, should understand going in that there are political uses of intelligence that have distorted the way Chinese look at the same issue we look at, and that we're going to have to sort of get inside their heads to understand where it's going if we want to try to influence them in a direction where our policy would like to go.
Andy?
Well, I want to just say that Perry, Orville, and I certainly do not hope to contribute to any increase of tension in U.S.-China relations through this project. We became involved because here are these materials, they are true. This is history, we are academics, so we put them out. The compiler even more so, or even less so, is even less interested in damaging U.S.-China relations. That would be disastrous in his view. I know.
I hope you didn't read that implication into my remark. I certainly didn't think that was the intent of the publication.
No, I am responding to 10 days or 2 weeks worth of sandblasting by the world media and the internet. So my skin is very sensitive to implications. But I think this is an important point for me to say to this group, that this is not part on our part, and even more so, as you can imagine, on the part of the people, the Chinese involved, not aimed at damaging or U.S.-China relations, and not really aimed at helping it either, because there's not much in the book about U.S.-China relations. Somebody mentioned that there's a document in there where, I think it was by the State Security Ministry, written at the instruction of Li Peng, which shows how the whole mess was created by the VOA and the State Department's International Visitor Program and by the KMT's fund that they set up and so forth. That was presented to the leaders, and some of the leaders apparently took that quite seriously. They took international press coverage very seriously, as I mentioned before, and often seemed to feel that if the Washington Post, for example, published something and said that this is what's going to happen, that somehow that was going to be made to happen. But as far as the issues that David Shambaugh lists in his Foreign Affairs article that are important issues today, Taiwan, TMD, WTO, I forget what they were, none of those figures in the book. If you really read the book, and I don't hold out too much hope that all members of Congress will read the entire book, but to the extent that a member of Congress or staff actually reads the book, they will get a more complicated picture of the people involved in the situation. It's not a simplistic picture.
We sent them the trot of the book, which is to say the article, to all the members of Congress.
Some of them may get through the New York Times excerpts.
Let's,
Quick read.
It's time for some questions from the floor. If you would stand up and identify yourself. Yes, sir, right here.
Jeremy
And here
Stone.
comes a mic. I should mention that as well.
Jeremy Stone, Catalytic Diplomacy. The basis of the third of the book that I've read, I had new sympathy for the people that voted for martial law at the time, and from what Ambassador Roy said, maybe more sympathy for how it played out in the end, if in fact you believe that the democratic reforms would have failed at the time. So I wanted to know of the panelists who've read the book, would they have supported martial law at the time, or in retrospect, would they have thought, do they think that martial law worked out well for China? This, of course, is not a popular view in the United States, but it seems to me this is one effect that might be had of the book.
Who would like to take that one? It's an intriguing question.
Well, I'll start just very quickly. I don't think there can be any justification for the use of the brutality that was used in Tiananmen to deal with the problem. But we're creating an artificial construct. The root of the problem is that the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party was deeply split at the very top. Let's not forget, Zhao Ziyang was the head of the Chinese Communist Party. He was the chairman. And he and other members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, it was split 3-2, with one actually a kind of neutral. I think in this respect, this is a fairly accurate representation of it. The reason why the brutality occurred is not because the Chinese are more brutal than others. It's because they weren't able to agree on the measures that should be taken to deal with it in ways that could have avoided violence. The result was the group that did not favor violence ended up losing in the struggle, and the other group ended up using violence in order to accomplish their purpose. Was it justified? The answer is I don't see how we can justify it. But in their eyes it was necessary because essentially they had not been able to pursue any other options.
They justified it because they defined it ultimately after early April as a matter of life and death for the regime. As time goes by and you read these documents, the sense of crisis certainly builds, and the sense of longevity, if that's the right word, of the regime is front and center. So martial law was not only seen as necessary to restore the regime because the problem was defined that way, to maintain the regime rather, but then because it was successful, it maintained the regime in power. Again, another incorrect conclusion.
I'm going to make a quixotic intervention. We've been treated to State Roy's seminar this evening on what happened in the 80s and 90s, and one would be willing to pay a Harvard or Yale or even perhaps a Princeton tuition to hear stuff like this on a regular basis. But there's a book that really that resonates with this episode. It was published about 20 years ago by Ray Huang. It's called 1579, A Year of No Significance. 1587, excuse me. Very important. He's teaching it, I'm not. But the book really exposes the Chinese political culture, and when splits emerge, horrible things happen, to put it very shortly. And if you want to go into the captivity of the Chinese in their own decision-making process by their political culture, this Ray Huang's 1587 is a good way to do it.
Yes, sir, right there.
Min Xin Pei with Carnegie Endowment. I have two questions. One concerning the motivation. And here I see some discrepancy. If you want to push political reform in China, and I understand that in China the sentiment for that is relatively okay, it's quite strong among certain circles. And I understand that documents or materials came out of China about 2 years ago, if not early. Why wait till you turn everything to English? So well packaged. Why don't, because you can't wait. You want to push for political reform. Time is of the essence. You want to go right away, and you know, if you're politically sophisticated enough, you know that any publication in Chinese material will have a far more direct, quicker impact on China.
So why not come out with the
Why not
Chinese edition first?
Chinese edition first,
Yeah.
then piecemeal release.
Let's ask Andy.
First one. Second, we have not talked about the mechanics of secrets keeping in China. And I think this came out, I spoke to a lot of people, Chinese, who know a little bit about the mechanics of record keeping. And on my basis of the reading, which is just the Foreign Affairs article, I have not read the book, it seems to me that documents or original materials came from various agencies. So here we have several key assumptions to make. First of all, I doubt very much the curious assertion that it was a group effort, because it would have involved a very large network of sympathizers, because we also have to exclude the possibility that the Chinese leadership centralized all the records. There was no political reason.
Try and tighten it up just a little bit.
That's a cut from everywhere, because they wanted to keep this thing behind. There was no political, at least non-political effort, plan to centralize documents to have a straight record. So that also, the levels of secrets are graded, several gradations.
And what is your point?
The point here is that you have to involve people in various degrees, because there's also a need-to-know basis
Okay,
for those.
let's let Andy respond to this, because we've got a lot of other people waiting for questions. Andy.
With respect to the Chinese edition, the compiler, as I call him, he couldn't interface with anybody, so this whole project fell on me. And I, in fact, tried to publish a Chinese edition first, and it turned out to be difficult. First of all, I did explore with a couple of Taiwan publishers. They weren't terribly interested. They didn't think there would be much of a market. And I was not too keen on working with Taiwan because I really didn't think that would carry the right flavor. Also, I'm in New York. It's not easy for me to interface. It didn't go very far, and I let it go. In Hong Kong, it's very difficult to safely contact publishers. I couldn't go on an auction like a literary agent and take bids. I contacted a publisher who I trusted, and I think appropriately so, who was very pessimistic about the market possibility, especially because the book will be immediately pirated, and anybody who publishes it in Hong Kong will not make much money, but will take tremendous risk. Perhaps I could then have pursued the Chinese edition further and done only that, but in the meantime, I tried to look into the other channel, and that channel opened up, so I did it. And that's the story. And so there's sometimes a lot less, meaning in certain events than it may appear. With respect to, nobody has ever said that there was a large network of persons involved, and nobody has ever said that there is or there isn't a central archive and so forth. So I understand what you're trying to do is to imagine how this could have happened. And I agree that you should try to imagine that. I asked about it, and I tried to figure it out for myself, and I feel that I have figured it out. Unfortunately, I can't tell you, but it happened in a way that makes sense and which could happen.
More questions? Bob Kaiser.
I'd like to ask about, excuse me, Bob Kaiser, the Washington Post. Have you seen documents yourself, or have you seen only this transcript?
The question of whether I have seen documents is one that I'm avoiding at this point by giving the following answer, which is that if I were to see documents, it wouldn't materially help me with the issue of authenticity because I don't have the technical means to assess the difference between a good forged document and a real document, like chemical analysis and so forth. For me, the content of documents as they were transcribed is the critical thing that I evaluated.
Way in the back. That's right there. Yes, sir.
Bob Cap from the U.S.-China Business Council. Just a couple of things. Back in the mid-'80s, I sat in the friendship store with a young Chinese cadre or bureaucrat one night and said, oh, well, after all, a new generation is coming, younger men, they're more sophisticated, blah, blah, blah. And this guy looked at me and said, Bob, just remember, in China, somebody is always 80 years old. In some way, and I remembered that. In some ways, what we read gives you that kind of sinking feeling that W.J.F. Jenner expressed in his book, what was it called? The
Burden of History.
The Burden of History.
1587.
The sort of nothing ever changed. But on the other hand, when you read this gripping book, when you realize that 8 elderly gentlemen, most of whom did not hold specific positions, took the most supreme decisions that anybody could make in the largest of all countries because the established authorities broke down. When you listen to them saying, Jesus, we saw what happened in the Cultural Revolution, we're not going to let it happen again, there is a certain sense in which this is very time-specific. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there really are no elders now of anything like the same stature, leaving aside maybe Boy, he's still alive, that there were in numbers and in positions to really just take over and throw the General Secretary out, call in the troops back then. Are we looking at a system which has fundamentally frozen, or are we looking at a terrible moment in time which can never be reproduced? And then just quickly 2 others. I think the leadership comes off looking surprisingly well. And then apropos to Congress, where, as you know, I spend a fair amount of time, pardon me, the usual suspects will say the usual things, but actually, I think, first of all, most people won't give a damn. The book, On the Hill, and I don't think the book is going to make a great deal of difference to the political dialogue, because I don't think most people are going to read it. And second of all, I think that actually those who do read it will find themselves, as Andy has suggested, with a surprising kind of uneasy sense that these guys were in a terrible dilemma, and some of them had deep old values that they really wanted to live by. And the last point is you guys have done Zhurongji a disservice by suggesting that nobody in the leadership since 1989 countenance has changed in China, because I think certainly in the context of the WTO's implications for China, the Zhu, for one, has a pretty good notion of what is going to change.
Thank you. If you can remember his first point, Steve, you want to comment on it?
The first point was...
Are there any elders?
Was it a particular moment? at Tiananmen, a time when there were 8 elders who could do what they did, or is it an ongoing problem of the structure of Chinese leadership? I think that's part of the question.
I don't think it was totally isolated in time. In other words, you still have the issue of elders, just because of the way the system works, where, you know, Li Peng, when he stops being premier, moves over to the MPC. You don't have the structure that you had in the 80s when Deng had created the Central Advisory Commission in order to park the old cadre who couldn't simply be left without some prestigious position. And you don't have the revolutionary elders around anymore, so people don't have the authority of the people who actually participated in the revolution. You still have the problem of current leaders being second-guessed by retired elder leaders who retain enough prestige to be able to influence it. Having retired myself, I find this an attractive model.
Andy?
The issue of whether there will be elders, I think, is an issue that's very much being struggled over right now, and in a way the book, although not aimed chiefly at that, will have some effect on it. That is to say, can Li Peng and Jiang Zemin become elders in the future? And the other structural theme that's continuous is the one about the military being a totally independent element in the power tripod. You have the party, the state, and the military. The military doesn't report to anybody but the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is Jiang Zemin. That's a post that doesn't have a term of office. It's a post that doesn't end in 2002 or 2003. And whoever is in that position is in a position to have a decisive influence in crises.
Up front. David, go ahead while we're getting Mike up.
A brief addition. I think it was a moment in time, and it really showed that China in 1989 was still very much a system of men and not institutions. But in the decade since, these elders, 7 of the 8 of them anyway, have passed away. But I think we've seen the normalization of elite politics more towards institutions and away from personalities, particularly those who retired. When you retire today, you retire at the retirement age, and the military in particular is enforcing this norm more so than the party. But indeed, the party Congress in 2002 is going to be proof of this pudding. We're having a 50 to 60% turnover of the Central Committee. But the retirement norm is being instituted, and once you retire, the pension, the traditional pension to intervene in politics has not been as noticeable for the last 10 years as it was previously. So I think we've had a qualitative change, Bob, in the last decade. And that's part of what I call regularization and normalization of elite politics. Last thing, Zhao Ziyan is still alive. I'm his biographer, I know. He's born October 1919. He's tanned, ready, and rested. And in Chinese political terms, he's about the same age as Deng Xiaoping was when he came back the 3rd time. I'm not predicting Zhao's comeback, but as long as he's alive, you know, he is a factor. And if for some confluence of events, the reformists are able to win out, he will be a factor. And he's in relatively good health, apparently. Some heart trouble, but still under house arrest.
Yes, ma'am.
Nancy Bernkopf Tucker, Georgetown University. I'm persuaded of authenticity, but what I'm worried about is selectivity. As a historian, I am troubled by whatever the agenda may have been that managed to break out this particular type of information, these particular documents, for some purpose that we're not, or maybe you, Andy, are sure of. But when our CIA publishes one of their glossy things and they have a conference and the historians will all come in and say, look, you're only giving us, 10 when you've got hundreds, why should we believe this? When China allows something to be published, the works of whoever, those are selected for effect. When the Soviet Union fell and documents started coming out, we only got certain ones for certain purposes. How do we know what we're not seeing, and doesn't that trouble us?
The agenda of the compiler, he has a statement in his preface to the book, so I would say that as a historian, you'll feel that a stated agenda is better than an unstated one. So that's there, and you can read it and read it with as many grains of salt as you want and see how it stacks up. Part of the agenda requires a high degree of honesty in the process. In other words, he would defeat his own agenda if he published something that lacked credibility and which was grossly biased. And Orville addresses this in his afterword, and I think it is germane, is that when you read the whole book, as David has indicated, you don't find a vulgar agenda. You don't find Zhao presented as a shining light and Li Peng as a monster in human guise. So there's no agenda of that sort, but on your other question, it is pertinent. How do we know that we have the whole story? It's inconceivable that we have the whole story in the following sense. When the whole Chinese book comes out, that's just one book. You have a government, a vast bureaucracy, and the largest population in the world that churns along for a month and a half or 2 months. It obviously produces roomful after roomful after roomful of documents that we are not in a position to publish. So it isn't the complete record. Let's take the question of what happened in the provinces. I mean, you may be a specialist in Sichuan. Sichuan is a huge place. It has a population of about 100 million. And in those days, when Chongqing was part of Sichuan, it had an even larger. We have X number of reports from Sichuan. I don't know, 10. You know, can that be the whole story? It can't be, and so forth. So I agree, there is selectivity, but what we have to worry about is whether there's a distorting type of selectivity other than what we have all said. I mean, in my case, in the intro, I said that I wanted to focus on the decision-making process in Zhongnanhai, and I exercised selectivity for that purpose. And that was an agenda. I mean, it's an academic agenda. It was my feeling that that's the cutting edge here, so that's what I did.
We've got more hands up than I can handle in the 10 minutes left, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm also going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time and ask our panelists just to make a note of anything they hear that they want to respond to. And we'll start with this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Erping Zhang. I'm a business consultant from New York City, and currently I'm also a voluntary spokesperson for Falun Gong. And I would like to first comment on Professor Nathan's book because I was very impressed reading his work. Through the reading, I was seeing the paranoia reflected in the Chinese leadership in cracking down on current Falun Gong practitioners. And does this panel see the consistent pattern of paranoia in this current leadership? And if so, what do you think of the reason for the Chinese government to crack down on the Falun Gong practitioners that we're reading?
Falun Gong, you said?
Yes.
Okay.
And also, how should the U.S. government respond to the,
Okay.
should we support the rights of the people to seek freedoms?
Good question.
Yes, sir.
David Apgar from the Corporate Executive Board. Just a quick question. Do we know anything about the possibility of violent repression in Xi'an just before Tiananmen? I asked because my wife and I found a discernibly traumatized population just passing through there on April 30th of '89.
And there was a big incident on April 22nd, which is in the book. I think
Okay, let's take one more question back there. We'll get you in the next round. Yes.
Yep, Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence
No, it was
Review.
a separate
Just one question about the timing of the publication of the English language version of this book. I mean, it's obvious to everybody that's 2 weeks before the inauguration. The president-elect has got to decide who's going to be in charge of China policy. There has been a big debate on whether or not we should continue the engagement policy of the previous administration. And isn't the publication of this book in English with a great fanfare by the Council of Foreign Relations kind of like throwing a match into a dried haystack? Okay. Can only be detrimental to U.S.-China relations.
All right, well, Andy can start for the book and I'll answer for the magazine.
Well, I already answered Pei Min Shin about why we didn't put out a Chinese edition first, which if we had done so would have been much earlier because it took time, as Min Shin pointed out, to do the translation. We tried to publish it as soon as we could. The fact that it couldn't come out until now is a source of regret. This is not done on purpose. Granted, the publisher, Peter Osnos, wouldn't have published a book like this on the week of inauguration. No publisher will do that. Because they won't get any newspaper coverage. But, other than that tiny time adjustment, we have published it as quick as we could.
Foreign Affairs has very few adaptations from books. When we do, we obviously have to coincide the publication of our adaptation with the publishing schedule of the book. We can't do it before the book. Publishers don't like that. If you do it too long afterwards, people say, well, the book's already been out for X months. Why are you doing that? I don't recall any discussions in the months that we all worked together on this of a political calendar coming up. Instead, the discussions really were on several very fundamental questions that we're still asking. The documents, are they authentic? If they are authentic, are they manipulated in some way or selected in some way that we have to be very careful about? Are the translations right? Have we got the physical facilities for the publishing both of the book and the magazine in line to go ahead and go forward? These kinds of, it's kind of like, I think it was Matisse who once said, what do artists talk about, instead of some abstract idea? He said the quality of the paint we're buying. We were talking about very practical problems, not the political calendar in the United States. However, it's a question that has come up. It's a very legitimate question, given the coincidence of the timings here. But I think our feeling was that whatever time we were to publish, it was or wasn't going to have approximately the same effect on the political debate here and on American policy. As Andy has explained, our hope was that it would be seen as a very interesting, perhaps important body of knowledge, but not one that should be in and of itself and by itself determining of what American policy should be. As for the political debate in this country, which at some points has gotten a bit extreme, that's going to go on whether we publish this particular document or not. There's always something around to put your hands on if you want to make an argument. Any other comments? We've got about 4 minutes left.
I'll comment just quickly on the paranoia Falun Gong issue. There is a parallel. In fact, I could even quibble with the use of the term paranoia. The leadership was deeply concerned by the demonstrators because the sympathy for the goals of the demonstrators was so widespread in the power establishment. That's what concerned them. So it wasn't a trivial issue. The regime had an easy capability to deal with a few thousand demonstrators. The issue here was that it wasn't simply university students coming from various places in China. It's that the bureaucracy, the military, the others, all of them thought that the opposition to corruption and the other demands, they wanted change at the time. In that sense, I think there is a parallel to the Falun Gong. The Falun Gong is not viewed as a threat by most Chinese, and it's not viewed as a threat by most Chinese in the power establishment. They were members. Some of them were adherents, the wives of senior cadre and officials. That's what's concerned to them. Here is an organization not controlled by the party, which is demonstrating appeal to people. And this represents the potential core of organized, non-governmentally controlled organization. And that's anathema to them because it threatens their political control. So in that sense, there's a parallel, but the parallel shouldn't be pushed too far.
Say quickly, you mentioned the word corruption. At the time of Tiananmen, the students cited corruption as one of the rationales for their demonstrations. And in these documents, we have the leadership constantly talking about it. And Deng Xiaoping saying, we've got to get a hold of this, or it will undermine us. Right. If the press is to be believed today, corruption is certainly not any smaller, maybe even greater than it was then. How serious a problem is it in terms of political ongoingness, so to speak?
It's enormously important because it's essentially undermined the credibility of the government. I mean, for me, who lived in China during the final 2 years of the KMT regime, to hear official Chinese, comparing the levels of corruption in China now to the levels of corruption in China in 1948 and 49, hits you between the eyes, because we know what happened. So the regime is concerned about corruption, and in fact, is taking some actions. You know, to draw a parallel between Indonesia, where corruption is also enormously difficult, in the 3.5 years that I was in Indonesia, the government never took a single action against corruption. China repeatedly puts senior officials in jail, executes them, takes actions against them. So the government is concerned about the issue and in fact is trying to deal with it, but it's only dealing with the tip of the problem and it hasn't gotten to the root of the problem, which is that there's money and there's guanxi, and the two together is how you make things happen in China, and that breeds corruption. And so their efforts are not getting to what's breeding corruption, which is a rationally organized administrative structure so you can get things done without having to pay or go through the back door.
We are out of time, I'm sorry to say. Let me just ask if any of our panelists have one final comment before we close for the evening. Andy? All set? Well, listen, help me thank these terrific panelists. Thank you all very much. That was terrific. Thank you.
More moderating, sir.
Good job keeping it going. Yes, Steve, nice to see you again.
Andrew Nathan is a political science professor and former director of the East Asian Institute and co-editor of the Tiananmen Papers with Orville Schell and Perry Link. The book was sent to the United States by alleged Chinese reformers whose identities remain unknown. It contains the insight into the motives of Chinese leaders during the 1989 pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. It's published by Public Affairs, and for more information, visit their website at publicaffairsbooks.com. "48 hours of non-fiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Coming up, history on Book TV with presidential historian Michael Beschloss, editor of the American Heritage Illustrated Dictionary of the American Presidents. After that, John Mutter, Publishers Weekly executive editor for Bookselling, discusses book sales in 2000 and holiday store profits for book chains and independent bookstores. Next weekend on Book TV, an Encore Book Notes interview with taxation law specialist Charles Adams, discussing his book on the history of tax policy, called For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes on the Course of Civilization. Then on Public Lives, William Rentschler examines the political career of Republican Senator Barry Goldwater and his political legacy. Later in the evening, History on Book TV features James Carroll leading a discussion on Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, A History. Authors taking part, Cynthia Ozick and Mary Gordon. Next Sunday on Book TV, In Depth, live with Pulitzer and Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison. We'll examine her writings and stories about race and gender, her literary criticisms and novels, as well as her publishing career as a Random House editor before becoming a best-selling author. In Depth, live with Toni Morrison, taking your calls and talking about her life and her books. Next Sunday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, and re-airing at midnight Eastern. Only on Book TV, only on C-SPAN 2. You're watching Book TV. Each weekend, C-SPAN 2 offers you 48 hours of programs about nonfiction books, authors, and the publishing industry. Write to us with your comments or suggestions at 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001. Or call us at area code 765-464-3080. Michael Beschloss is a presidential historian and author of Taking Charge, the Johnson White House Tapes, 1963 to 1964. He was selected by American Heritage to edit their illustrated history of the President's 2000 edition. Next, he discusses how presidents are rated over time by historians. His remarks were made at last fall's Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's an hour 10 minutes and is this week's history segment.
As chairman of the Lincoln Forum, I'm very pleased to introduce to you a man who literally and figuratively needs no introduction because his handsome visage has been on the media, electronic media, for the last week since the election results were announced or not announced, as the case may be. And watching Michael Beschloss, along with his friend and our friend Doris Kearns Goodwin, attempt to explain it, place it in perspective, reminded me of what G.K. Chesterton said in the 1930s. Democracy is sometimes like a person blowing his nose. It is not always nice, but it is better to do it yourself. Now, Michael Beschloss, as USA Today pointed out, along with other historians who comment and appear in attempt to place things in context, perform a vital service for our democracy because they act, as this article pointed out, as a calming effect on the hysteria that other people in the media go through at a time like the election of 2000. And we're all grateful for that. This should have occurred years ago. And it's only been in recent times where the news media have called upon people like Michael Beschloss and Doris Kearns Goodwin and others to help put things in perspective. And we call that having a sense of history, which I think really helps our democracy. Michael Beschloss is a great historian, one presently working on, I think, as most of you know, a book on the Lincoln assassination. We can hardly wait for it to be completed and published. But I first read Michael's book, Taking Charge, which covered a portion of the LBJ presidency. And what fascinated me about Michael was his attention to detail and his effort to search the truth for the truth. And that's what historians, as lawyers and judges, attempt to do every day, search for the truth. Things are not always as they appear. As Michael pointed out in Taking Charge in the very beginning, where, for example, he cited the William Manchester book about John Kennedy, and bear with me here because it shows the point-counterpoint of virtual reality and what other people perceive reality to be. Manchester writes that although Kennedy believed that all killing was senseless, Lyndon Johnson cajoled him. This is a trip that President-elect Kennedy took to the LBJ Ranch in Texas. Johnson cajoled him into a deer hunt at dawn, during which Kennedy looked into the face of the life he was about to take, fired, and quickly turned back to the car. LBJ on tape. Forcing that poor man to go hunting? Hell, he not only killed one deer, he insisted on killing a second. One took 2 hours, and then, by God, he insisted on killing one for O'Donnell, and we just worked so hard, it took 3 hours, and I finally gave up. Poor little deer, he saw it in his eye, and he just could not shoot it. Well, hell, he wasn't within 250 yards from it. He shot it, and he jumped up and hurrayed and put it right on the fender of the car so he could kill another one. And then later, in '64, in a conversation with his old friend, Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, with the Vietnam conflict heating up and our country being assured that the government's policy was steady, on path, winning, and in control, the president says to Russell, got lots of troubles. Russell, well, we all have those. LBJ, what do you think of this Vietnam thing? Russell, it's the damn worst mess I ever saw, and I don't like to brag. I never been right many times in my life. And I don't see how we're ever going to get out of it without fighting a major war. And all of them down there in those rice paddies and jungles. LBJ, that's the way I've been feeling for 6 months. Russell, it appears that our position is deteriorating. LBJ, how important is it to us? Russell, it isn't important a damn bit with all these new missile systems. LBJ, well, I guess it's important to us. Russell, from a psychological standpoint. So this effort that Michael Beschloss makes has contributed so much to our understanding of our immediate past, and I think our present as well as our future. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Beschloss.
Thank you so much, Frank. To hear that from you just warms my heart in a way that's almost hard for me to express. And especially because when you're writing about someone like Lyndon Johnson, you do have both the profound, which Frank borrowed from, and also sometimes a little bit the less profound. I came across a tape a couple of weeks ago that refers to the fact that Johnson once asked for a speechwriter to do a speech draft for a speech he had to give, and the speechwriter brought it in, and the draft began with this long quote. He was to say, as Aristotle said, and then this long quote. And Johnson reads the draft and says, I love the quote, but no one's going to know who Aristotle was, so just begin it as my daddy said. I've been trying to sort of summarize the difference between writing about Lyndon Johnson and Abraham Lincoln, and that's one of the examples. Another is that I think in writing about Abraham Lincoln, I probably will not encounter a gadget called the amphicar. Does anyone here know what the amphicar is or was? The amphicar is something that was made in the early 1960s, and I saw one down at the LBJ Ranch a couple of months ago where Lady Bird still lives, and she was kind enough to let me look around the ranch and the ranch house and the airplane hangar where Johnson used to keep his plane. And there I saw this little vehicle. It looks like sort of a Studebaker with no roof on it, about 1962, light blue. And I said, could this possibly be it? And yes, indeed it was, the amphicar. The amphicar was an amphibious car. And those of you who know about LBJ know that he always had to have the latest gadget that had been invented of almost any kind. The latest electric toothbrush, the latest razor, the latest device for calling his steward to bring in glasses of Fresco, which he referred to as Fresco, and also the amphicar. And I don't know where he got the idea for getting the amphicar, but it was about 1962, and I know that Johnson saw From Russia with Love in the early James Bond films, and I've got this image in my mind that Johnson saw James Bond in one of these amphibious cars, saw that and knew he had to have one. So in any case, he had this thing, and there's this little thing that looks like a Studebaker, and Johnson didn't just buy this for his own pleasure. Everything that Johnson did had a purpose. And when you're listening to tapes of Lyndon Johnson and sort of beginning to study him, it's almost the Lyndon Johnson School of Executive Management. The way the amphicar entered into all this was if you were a Johnson aide newly appointed to the staff, you'd be invited down to the ranch, and Johnson would say, let's go for a drive. So you'd go and get into this little thing that you'd figure was a Studebaker with no roof, and Johnson would gun the engine and be going about 120 miles an hour, perhaps with a paper cup of Pearl beer on the dashboard. And suddenly you'd find that you were riding with the president straight into the lake. And the car went in and the car began to sink. Now, this wasn't just Johnson having fun. As I say, in every case, he always had a serious purpose. And the serious purpose of this one was this new aide, whom he doesn't know very well, when the crunch comes and the car begins to sink, does he try to save his president or does he try to save himself? And you might suspect that the ABC News exit poll finds that 100% of the aides always try to save themselves. So you've got this scene where the car is sinking and the aide is scrambling out for dear life, and Johnson turns around and gives him a disgusted look, presses a button, the gills of this car inflate, they come back up to the surface, skids across the lake back to dry land. And for the rest of the guys, time on the Johnson White House staff, every time, especially that he got pumped up, Johnson would say, well, there's old Joe. He may pretend he's loyal to his president, but when the crunch came, do you know what he did? As I say, it's an experience that probably aides to President Lincoln did not have. I want to say both to Frank and to Harold and all of you, thank you so much for inviting me here this evening, especially because I'm really still near the beginning of my project on the Lincoln assassination rather than near the end, just at the end of my research and beginning to make sense of it all. I'm so glad that Doris Goodwin is going to be here on Saturday night, and a little bit envious because she's further along than I am. The USA Today story that Frank was kind enough to mention, he was particularly kind enough not to mention that it referred to the fact that when Doris and I are sitting off camera waiting to go on, we spend the time spinning off-color stories. So I sort of figure that someone may have known that, and that's why I'm here on Thursday night and she's here on Saturday night. I think you were afraid that if we were here together, we might spin off-color stories into the microphone before you all, and maybe into the television sets that are of people who are watching C-SPAN. But in any case, I'm going to be with her on Sunday. We're speaking at an event in Westchester County, New York, and I can find out from her how she did. I thought this might be one evening that could be free of words like recount and Florida and Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And if you thought that was true, you would be wrong. I think all of us who've been watching the news are sort of grateful that there is at least some connection between current events and history, and we don't have to stretch too far to imagine it. And I've had that a little bit in my own household. I have a 6-year-old boy named Alexander who I try to get interested in history, sometimes with some success, sometimes not. But never underestimate the power of a national crisis to get even 6-year-old boys interested in history. I went and spoke to his first grade class last week about the election, and I thought I'd be getting questions like, does the White House have a bowling alley, and what kind of dog does Al Gore have? And instead I got very sophisticated questions about the Electoral College, of all things. And also, a couple of days ago, I sat my boy down and said, you know, you're 6, and I want you to remember this week all your life, because you're seeing something that has never happened before in history. And he replied, what about Hayes and Tilden? So all I can say is that it may seem a little bit grim for all of you, but I'm hoping that the silver lining is that perhaps we can all teach a little bit of history, and even history of the 19th century. I should mention, Gabor was kind enough to mention that Doris and I are on PBS, and there's a little bit of a historical precedent for that. Doris and I have had the pleasure of being on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer since 1994, and that almost did not happen. And the precedent for that was that in 1973, Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil were pairing for the first time, combining to televise on public broadcasting the Senate Watergate hearings. And Jim got the great idea of putting on an historian during the intermission and the hearings to talk about whether Watergate had some historical precedents that people should know about. And so he made a wonderful choice, the historian Barbara Tuchman. She came down. And so during this 5-minute intermission, Jim said, Mrs. Tuchman, does Watergate remind you of anything in history? And Mrs. Tuchman replied, Jim, to understand Watergate, you have to go back to the 14th century. And as Jim tells the story, 1 minute passed, and 2 minutes passed, and 3 minutes, and 4 minutes, and the intermission was just about over, and he was relieved to hear her take a breath of air just before she said, "Now, Jim, that brings us to the 15th century." And the result was that Jim Lehrer did not put historians regularly on television for another, I think, 21 years. But we're sort of glad that he did. I should say also, before I get to the main subject of the evening, that the first time I actually saw a real live president or a future president was, of all things, on the Lincoln Highway in Illinois when I was about 4 years old. And this was Richard Nixon in the campaign of 1960. Once again, we're hearing so much about the campaign of 1960 this week in a way that I never would have imagined. It's precedent for the kind of accusations of vote fraud and bad counting that we're hearing about in Florida. But what happened there was Nixon was in a motorcade a couple of weeks before the election, so it was exactly 40 years ago this past month. And in those days, when Nixon went in motorcades like this, and particularly this one in South Cook County where I lived, Republican parents were asked to bring their small children by the side of the highway and hold them up in the air, sort of a theatrical prop as Nixon's Cadillac rolled by. And it turns out there was sort of a method to the madness, because as some of you will remember, that was the fall when Nixon was giving this stump speech over and over again saying, "Elect me and your children will not grow up under communism." So I was one of those. And actually it worked. I am not now, nor have I ever been. So anyway, that was 1960, and lo and behold, about 1992, I went and had lunch with, by then, former President Nixon at his house in New Jersey. And this is about February 1992. And in those days, the drill was that if you had lunch with Nixon, it would be about 3 hours, and you'd be with him in his library upstairs, and then lunch in the dining room, and then you'd repair to his sunroom. So I waited until we sat in the dining room and sat down to lunch, and I thought I would tell him what I hope was this charming little story about having seen him when I was 4 back in Cook County during the '60 campaign. And I said, "Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we have met before." And I told him the story. He fell dead silent, immediately changed the subject, and made no reference to anything I had said. And I almost felt as if I had done something gross in the middle of the table as I staggered out of the house. And I later on called a friend and I said, "What did I do wrong?" And he said, "I'll find out and tell you." Called me back a few days later. He said, "Turns out you struck out not once, not twice, but 3 times. Strike one, Nixon these days doesn't like to talk about what he considers to be ancient history. That was something that you raised. Strike one. Strike two, just in case he felt like discussing ancient history, probably the ancient history he would feel like discussing would not be the 1960 campaign, which he lost and felt was stolen from him by John Kennedy. And strike three, just in case through some rare lapse he felt like discussing ancient history and the 1960 campaign, probably the place he would feel like discussing would not be Cook County, Illinois. So the problem is that even when you're writing presidential history, when you're dealing with live presidents or former presidents, they do involve an element of personal diplomacy that you've got to be very sensitive to. When I began working on this Johnson project and listening to these tapes, which are tapes of about 1,000 hours of Lyndon Johnson's private conversations, probably the most stunning tape of all that I came across was probably the first tape that he made as president. And that was a tape that was on November 22nd of 1963. Johnson was on Air Force One, Love Field in Dallas. He got himself sworn in by Judge Sarah Hughes. And then the plane took off with Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson and the widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, in the president's coffin. And what happened was there was a history-minded officer who knew that this was going to be an historic flight. And in those days, if you were a president who wanted to call someone on the ground, it would go by radio from Air Force One, probably through Andrews Air Force Base. And a very bright, history-minded officer knew that this was going to be an historic flight, and he switched on a tape recorder. And the result is that you can hear the sounds of Lyndon Johnson on that historic day, his first 2 hours as president. And what you hear is the engines of Air Force One roaring. You hear the weeping Kennedy and Johnson aides in the background. And Johnson gets on the telephone and asks the operator to make his first call as president, which is going to be to Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, in Hyannisport. And you're hearing all these sounds, and you hear Johnson talking to the operator, and then you hear the operator getting Mrs. Kennedy on the line, and this is the kind of detail that just brings you in an historical moment like that. He's saying to Mrs. Kennedy, he's just about to say, "I've got President Johnson for you on the line," but he catches himself because he knows that for her to hear the words President Johnson just after she's been told that her son has been murdered is going to be too much. So you hear him catching himself and saying, "We have Mr. Johnson for you on the line." And then you hear Johnson get on the telephone and say, "Mrs. Kennedy, I wish to God there was something I could do. We're grieving with you." And then Lady Bird gets on and says, "Country is so lucky that it had your son as long as it did." And by this point, Mrs. Kennedy, very understandably, is weeping and just cannot go on any further. She gets off the telephone line. And when you listen to this, and this tape actually happened to be lost for many years, and I think I was the first one to hear it since 1963, you can't hear that tape and hear those moments and hear those sounds without understanding exactly what it was like to be Lyndon Johnson on that plane dealing with the situation. Americans who were stunned by the sudden death of this young president. They didn't know who did it. They didn't know much about Johnson. They knew that it had been done in his home state. And all these things crowding in on him and beginning to calm all the people around him who were on that plane, and call after call trying to calm the people on the ground, and through them, the people of the United States. And when I first heard this, and this would have been probably about 5 years ago, the instant thought I had was, if we had only had a tape recorder at the time that Franklin Roosevelt heard the news of Pearl Harbor, or a tape recording of Abraham Lincoln at the time of Fort Sumter, or at the time of Gettysburg. As wonderful as the sources that we have are, and as wonderful as the writing on those things, can you imagine what it would be like to hear Lincoln's actual voice and the people around him, and even the sounds in the room, the sounds in the background, just to take you back into that historical moment, which is what we historians, of course, all try to do. So in any case, that's what I'm beginning to try to do in writing this history of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which will begin, I think, probably a few weeks before Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater. And everyone always sort of thinks about how they came to write a book. In my case, I can remember the exact moment, and that was when I was about 7 years old. I lived, as I've mentioned, in Illinois, and I think probably some here will argue a little bit, but I would still argue that if you grew up in Illinois, Lincoln is more of a religion there than perhaps he is even in other states. And we felt it very strongly. And at the age of 7, I was brought down to see the Lincoln monuments in Springfield and New Salem. And it was April of 1963. It was just at the time of the Civil War centennial and all those anniversaries. And in fact, Robin McNeil tells me that he might have actually run into me because he was there doing something for the Today Show. It was around the time of the 14th of April. In any event, for a small child to go to the Lincoln Tomb and to go to New Salem and to go to 8th and Jackson streets and see all the other things in that area, it really was history brought to life. And as I've mentioned, I have a boy who's 6 years old and also another boy who's 4 years old. And I am extremely aware of the fact that, especially at that age, boys and girls, when they're exposed to an historical site and they begin to think about the events that have happened there, it's something that will live with them forever. And in my case, I was beginning to think I might like to become an historian, but I was scintillated by Lincoln, and particularly scintillated by the way he left this earth. How would America have been different had Lincoln lived, and even who exactly was to blame? I can't claim that I read any books like Otto Eisenschimmel or any of the other volumes, and I think probably a good thing that I did not. But even to a small child to be exposed to this, I think it sort of hits you in a primal way that it probably doesn't even a few years later. And I think in my adult life, this sort of connects with some of the 20th century history that I've tried to do, and without sort of overdoing the parallel, there have been many people who have drawn the comparison between the death of John Kennedy and the death of Abraham Lincoln, and there are more differences than there are similarities. But there are two things that I think haunt America about both events that I think are really common. One is the continuing wonder about who exactly was to blame, how wide the group of people around the gunman really was in Lincoln's case, or whether there was a conspiracy at all in Kennedy's case. And also back to that fascinating question, how would America now be different if the president had lived? In Lincoln's case, we can imagine America might have gone on a very different tangent had he emerged from Ford's Theater that evening and survived and gone on to serve as president for another term. And in Kennedy's case, the question also exists. If Kennedy had lived and gotten reelected and served as president in the late 1960s rather than Lyndon Johnson, would we have had the escalation in Vietnam that Frank was talking about in reading that transcript of that tape? Would the young people of this country have been as estranged from the establishment and their parents and grandparents as they turned out to be? Would we have had the kind of tumult in the 1960s that I think affects all of us today? And in a way, that's what makes an historical question a living question, and one that affects us all from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep, because here's a case in which one moment, had it gone differently, might have caused us to be living in a very different country. So I've been interested in writing on Lincoln and writing on the assassination since about the age of 7, but in writing other books, I got detoured in the 20th century, and then in the early 1990s, I thought, if I was going to start on this, this was going to be the time. And I went to see my editor in New York, Alice Mayhew, who I gather is going to be here either tomorrow or Saturday, who's also Doris's editor and a friend of Harold's. And I told her that I'd wanted to do this since I was 7 years old, and told her the book I had in mind. And she said, well, Michael, I think it's a wonderful idea, but I do hope you're not planning to write on every thought you had when you were 7 years old. I promised, and we were off to the races. And I've been doing the research ever since, and just beginning to get to the point where I can really make sense of the material I've collected and really begin to get writing. I was mentioning the fact that I try to get my children interested in the things that I'm writing about, and I've been very energetic in doing that on Abraham Lincoln. I've read them some of the children's biographies. I rather carefully skip over the death of Lincoln's mother for obvious reasons. But there's something about the Lincoln assassination that particularly fascinates small boys for reasons that I probably don't want to think about. But I've been trying to educate them about what I've been getting into, and I've been sort of half successful. Our 6-year-old says that he likes Abraham Lincoln, which is fine. The problem is the 4-year-old says that he likes John Wilkes Booth. I think he doesn't quite understand that this is not like Al Gore and George W. Bush sort of running against each other. Another little problem I had was I went to Richmond last year after speaking at the Virginia Historical Society and wanted to retrace Lincoln's steps in Richmond in April of 1865, and went to the wonderful Museum of the Confederacy and bought some books, all of which was fine, and brought them home. But what I didn't realize was that the shopping bag I got, which I think has something on it like a Confederate flag and perhaps the legend, "The South shall rise again," my little boy took it to kindergarten. His kindergarten teacher called me up and said that this was not exactly the most PC shopping bag that I could have sent to school, so I had a lot of explaining to do. But I think since then it's gotten a little bit straightened out. What I thought I would talk about this evening, especially because I'm at the beginning of this journey rather than the end, is to talk a little bit about how we historians and how we Americans think about past presidents and rate them as great presidents or not great, and then talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln in that context, particularly in terms of how we Americans, we historians, look at Abraham Lincoln in the year 2000, and particularly on the eve of the great bicentennial, which I think will even be greater thanks to Frank and Harold on the National Bicentennial Commission. And I think probably the place to start is, when I was a kid growing up in Illinois, I sort of thought that all the presidents would be arranged on a ladder of greatness, with Lincoln at the top and perhaps someone like Warren Harding at the bottom, and that all these people would be absolutely fixed and it never changed, and perhaps Ulysses Grant might be number 38, and perhaps Theodore Roosevelt might be number 7, and this would be sort of fixed in history. Only did I realize when I began as a presidential historian that the better metaphor is probably not a ladder or something like Mount Rushmore where these faces are fixed, but really more like a stock exchange. And I'm not saying that in deference to Alan Greenspan or the current boom. What I really mean is that presidential reputations, for the most part, really do tend to go up and down, depending on the kind of era that we're living in, what we know about a past president at a given time, and also the kinds of facets of their character and their career and their general leadership that historians are interested in writing about. One thing that historians manage to do in shaping the way that Americans see a past president is we have the benefit of information that people in real time don't have. Wonderful example of this is Dwight Eisenhower, because if you looked at Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, I think I was about 3 years old when he left office, so I don't have a clear memory myself. But those of you who do remember him, remember how much he was derided, the jokes that were made about Eisenhower, you know, the Eisenhower doll, you wind it up and it does nothing for 8 years. There was a thought that this was not a terribly intelligent man because of these press conferences with sentences